Welcome, everybody. I think most of you know me, but just for those of you who don't, my name is Chip Coldren. I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance for the Smart Policing Initiative. Today's webinar, which is presented by Dr. Brenda J from Suffolk University. She's also a subject matter expert with Smart Policing. This webinar is a follow-up to her recent webinar on organizational change. Her topic today is on the challenging issue of measuring organizational change, and not surprisingly, she has some helpful advice for us. As you may know, this is one in a series of webinars offered through the Bureau of Justice Assistance funded Smart Policing Initiative. We appreciate BJA's support of the webinars and of the initiative over the last few years. They're kind of caught up in the aftermath of the shutdown. There's a conference going on with IACP right now, so they cannot be on this webinar. But I know they're very interested and very supportive of this work that we're doing. Before I turn this over to Brenda, I just must make a few comments. Everybody should know that this webinar is recorded so other people can view it if they can't make it on today. So we should all be mindful about what we say. As the webinar proceeds, please, if you desire, make use of the chat room function to the right of your screen. It's helpful if you note any comments, questions, or clarifications that you need at any point along the way. We'll do our best to monitor that and respond. Also, please pay attention and respond to the evaluation form that you'll receive right after this webinar. We pay attention to them, and I can tell you that BJA does. And your responses on that evaluation help us think about other webinar ideas and other ways that we might be being of service to the smart policing community. So thanks everybody for joining us today. I know there's a lot of interest in Brenda's topic, so Brenda, let me turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Chip, and thank you everybody. Welcome to the Smart Policing webinar on measuring change. We're really pleased with the number of folks who are joining us today from a variety of worlds. Researchers, practitioners, people who are just generally interested in improving their organization. So I look forward to an interesting conversation. So some of you, as Chip had mentioned, some of you may have participated in the July webinar on organizational change, so it's great to see you back. But we have crafted our webinar today as a standalone, so you didn't have to participate previously. I'd like to echo some things that Chip said and thank my friends at CNA and sponsors at BJA and those who have helped in the review and the preparation of this webinar. I also want to recognize my partners from Palm Beach County in Michigan who will contribute to our conversation today. So the purpose of today's webinar is to review a number of ideas and strategies for measuring organizational change. So many of us are engaged in some sort of change or really thinking about it. So we will spend time reviewing the various benefits of measuring change, why you might be interested in tracking change. We'll touch upon the recommended stages or some steps that you might take to develop and implement a change measurement process. And then we will review several tools within these steps. In almost every evaluation or measurement endeavor, challenges arise. So we will talk about what you might expect and hopefully offer some ideas for addressing these challenges. I will integrate examples from the Smart Policing Initiative, and I hope that others who are here with us today will add to that conversation. I find that the webinar is so much more valuable when we get people contributing or building off of some of the points that are made in the actual webinar, so I would encourage you to do that. This webinar is designed for researchers and practitioners. This is not a topic that we leave solely to folks who have advanced training in research methods. So for those of you who do have some experience or exposure to evaluation or research methods, you may recognize some of the concepts. But for others, the webinar is really designed to offer some practical and solid ideas that can be implemented regardless of your role as a researcher or a practitioner. This is by no means a research methods class, but it's a conversation consisting of some ideas, concepts, and steps that will help a variety of individuals evaluate their organizational change efforts. So I want to start by just suggesting that we think about organizational change as something that is organization-wide, as a broad effort, as opposed to smaller changes that might occur within the department or your organization. Smart policing specifically seeks to introduce and evaluate change across a variety of operational and organizational challenges, including some of the examples that are presented here. So in this way, we're talking about changes in policies and practices that really alter the mission, goals, and or strategies of organizations. I think we can all agree that the past several decades, we've seen a lot of organizational change within law enforcement, and certainly across many of the communities and the partner organizations that we may engage with. For example, the adoption of community policing, the integration of data into decision-making, and the use of social media and other technologies are all examples of change. So I want to think about our own change experiences or agendas as we move through the discussion today. I will rely on a lot of my current work with the Lowell, Massachusetts Smart Policing Initiative as they try to embark on some change and measure that change. And I think it'll certainly point out to the benefits, but also some of the challenges. A very important point for all of us to hold on to is that organizational change efforts often fail, or they fail to reach the level of success that we hope for. But despite this, we must not lose the lessons in those attempts. There is real value for our current practice and our future practice if we pay attention to the lessons learned from change. Fundamentally, organizational change is about doing something in a new way, gaining new information, learning something new, and behaving in a new way. So we should want to know if one or more of the changes leads us to our goals. We can learn from the process of introducing and measuring change for our future efforts. So I would suggest that what we learn should inform our future decisions. I think back to the examples of community policing as one particular law enforcement example. Some may ask, did it work or did it not work? Some others may be interested in knowing what exactly worked. And for our conversation, how do we know if it worked? In Lowell, the Smart Policing Initiative, one of the Smart Policing initiatives is focused on institutionalizing evidence-based practices with a heavy emphasis on changing training practices at various levels. So we want to assess how we go about introducing and sustaining that change. We're interested in whether the integration of evidence-based practices impacts how officers do their work on the street. So it's an important place for us to start is to ask why we are interested in measuring change. I'd say that there are many reasons for measuring change. We would want to, some of us may want to identify and understand the impact of our change and what specific activities contributed. We may be interested in improving services or programs. We may want to verify that you're making the right decisions. Measurement can produce data and verify results. We might be interested in supporting replication. Also, tracking and measuring change allows us to catch when change efforts are either slipping or falling off track. So just the mere activity of paying attention to and measuring change can help us to see when maybe a change effort is either losing steam or may possibly being derailed. So understanding what's happening in the change process is very valuable. An important follow-up question beyond did the change actually have the desired impact is what did we do that helped produce the outcomes? So these are all the kinds of questions that you would want to be asking yourself as you start to think about the value of measuring change. There may be other reasons that you're thinking about, but ultimately what you want to be thinking about is, and a place to start is, what's motivating us to measure change? So starting there are two fundamental questions that you would want to ask that serve as building blocks. First, what is the purpose for measuring change? That is individualistic, based on what your needs are, what your efforts are, what's going on in your own department. So that's a conversation that's really important as a starting point. Answering this question helps to define the scale and the scope of your measurement work. For example, are you interested in assessing implementation for some documentation purpose? Are you using measurement to serve in some accountability mandate? Are you documenting to describe a new program or strategy, and also to track how it is actually being implemented as opposed to how you imagine it should be implemented? You might be measuring change to create a list of possible causes and effects depending upon what your interests are. Or you just may be measuring change to make some sort of improvements. So these questions help you identify whether you will focus on the process of change or the outcomes of the change efforts or both. Once you have a good sense of the purpose that you are resting on for measuring change, you then want to ask, how will I go about measuring change? In research methods terms, this speaks to the design of the measurement approach and whether you will collect data about the process, as I mentioned, which is often found in narratives or change process documents or minutes or different various forms of qualitative data. Or you may be focused on the outcomes, which are often but not always reflected in quantitative data. So outcome data, that's primarily numbers. But either way, asking how you will measure will help inform whether you will focus on the process, the outcomes, or both. These fundamental starting points will help you work through the measurement process, and they really do provide a starting place at the kinds of conversations that you want to have in the idea generation phase of change measurement. So I want to move to specific steps that will guide you through the change measurement process. These are not inclusive of every potential step, but I feel like there are some basic steps that will help to facilitate the planning and implementation of change measurement. So we're focused, this is sort of possibly a checklist that you might use, and I want to recognize that in an ideal world, maybe a world where we've changed our habits to include routine measurement and evaluation, we would integrate these steps as a parallel to the planning and introduction of change. So while you're initiating change, you're also initiating the measurement of change. There are numerous ways to design an evaluation approach. Some are more sophisticated than others, but these steps, while not inclusive, they provide you with a structure that you can use to introduce measurement often and at the onset of change. Now, understandably, introducing change measurement at the beginning of change is not always possible. It's not always necessary, but it's better. So for those who are thinking about new change initiatives, I want you to start thinking about, well, how do we go about measuring that change to see what the results are? In our Lowell, in my work with the Lowell Police Department on their Smart Policing grant, I was actually called in to a meeting with the Lowell PD leadership when they were writing the Smart Policing grant, so at the very beginning. In that meeting, they talked about the desire to institutionalize evidence-based practices. So we discussed, one, how that would be operationalized, how would they actually make that happen, and then we would develop an appropriate evaluation to be included in the grant proposal. I'm a big advocate for measuring change early, paying attention to the implementation process, and I think that there are a lot of lessons and a lot of opportunities to either modify or expand on or alter your implementation as a result of that process. So this slide offers some steps within each of the phases. First is the planning to measure change, and that's really the foundation of the measurement process. It allows you to really reflect on what the change goals are, figure out how do you measure those goals, can we measure them, are we thinking about realistic ways to measure, then thinking about, well, what data exists or what data would we need to collect in order to actually identify whether or not we have reached those change goals. So this early stage, this fundamental stage, is really the place where you really do sort of craft your measurement approach. You would then look at, well, how do we go about capturing that data? What are the existing ways that we can do that? What are new ways that we may have to create? And we'll talk a little bit more about these various methods for measuring change. But an equally important conversation to have at this point is to be thinking about the results and the dissemination. So you may immediately be thinking about, well, how can I, as a manager, as a leader, as a program facilitator, think about the results? But what's the audience beyond you that may be interested? How do you get that information out there, and how do you feed this information back in to future decision making? So ultimately, there are various steps that are helpful, but remember that your entire evaluation approach, the way that you design the measurement process, really should speak directly to the purpose that you have previously identified. Answering this question about purpose will help direct you to all of your subsequent measurement activities. So as you work through this process, the next step after you settle on the purpose, you can focus on what. What is it that you're going to measure? And I can tell you that this can be almost as difficult as specifying the purpose of your evaluation work. As I noted, you may want to look at the process of introducing and implementing change, and what happens along the way, and what challenges and what lessons, what opportunities arise. You may also want to measure the outcomes that came about as a result of the change. So you could ask yourself, what's of interest and how does it speak to the purpose of the evaluation? As you answer these questions and you focus on what it is you're actually going to measure, it might help to think about 3 different elements of this process and outcome framework. First is the context. You may be really interested in something about the setting or the features of the implementing environment that might be important. So that could include something like what kind of economic constraints existed or affected the implementation, what about the availability of new technologies or limitations based on technology. So you may be interested in sort of all of these contextual factors that either influence your change or are affected by your change. Another element that you may be interested in is specifically the activities that are implemented. So, for example, what new or modified policies or procedures were introduced? What did this change look like? So, for example, if you were interested in establishing maybe a community domestic violence resource center or some new type of training delivery system, sort of what did it look like? What was it made up of? What specific activities were undertaken as part of that change? And then lastly, you may be interested in measuring some underlying cause and effect elements or variables that might help you focus on which factors are or were expected to produce certain kinds of outcomes. So, for example, using a new intranet system, does that increase officer awareness of certain community threats? Or does introducing a new evidence-based practice around maybe a crime strategy actually provide you with the results that you were expecting? So what you want to be doing here is thinking about, you want to build on that question of what's the purpose of change and what you expect to change. This what slide really helps you focus on specific ideas, either the behaviors, the practices, the outcomes that can be measured. Specifying what it is you want to measure will help you identify the specific data that you need to answer those measurement questions. Before I move on, I want to give you a minute to process, but I want to take this time to offer an anecdote just to reinforce sort of this idea of the building blocks. I teach in the master's program in public service here at Suffolk, and I have professionals who are in public service who are back in graduate school. And a lot of these folks, like you, are looking for ways to either show that what they're doing is working or evaluate something new. And a common question at the very beginning of the semester is whether they can use a survey or a focus group or some other type of data collection method to evaluate their program. And what I have come to learn is that my standard answer is that it depends on the questions that you're trying to answer. So I reinforce that idea, because once you work through that planning and those foundational building blocks, most of these subsequent steps should really fall into place. And so as we delve into this idea, remember that spending time on the front end will really help you to build a meaningful and practical approach. What I'd like to do now is sort of move beyond my own example, and I have asked Lieutenant David Moss from the Palm Beach County Smart Policing Initiative to offer a few comments about his experience and some of the specific types of activities and questions that we have talked about so far. So Lieutenant Moss, I would just like you to comment on but build on some of the things that we've talked about or some of the questions that are here. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Brenda. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, yep, we can hear you.
Okay. I think one of the things that you spoke about is in deciding what to measure. One of the things that we had in our project was in the context category, social or cultural changes, and how to measure that. And it was somewhat subjective. We were dealing with a migrant population and their interaction with law enforcement. And one of the things was, did they feel comfortable reporting crime and coming to law enforcement? And at the beginning of our initiative, they were somewhat reluctant to come in because of fear of deportation and things like that. But as we increased our community outreach and consulted with our research partners how to measure their level of comfort coming to us, by the end of the initiative, it greatly increased, and they were coming to us much more frequently.
So as you were going through that process, can you just speak a little bit about how you were sort of paying attention to or tracking what was occurring and how that influenced your decisions?
Yeah, it was a little difficult because we had to, our research partner through Lynn University had to design surveys for the migrant population, making sure that they could even understand what kind of things we were asking them. And we did have to modify several of the surveys from beginning to the end of the project in terms of whether or not they effectively measured what we were trying to capture in terms of the comfort level of the so-called victims or migrant workers coming to law enforcement. So it was always a work in progress to try and measure that because of the subjectivity. But in the end, it definitely did work, but it took a lot of consulting with the research partner to make sure that what we were trying to measure actually got measured.
Oh, I was down today, Chapel Street, looking at the meters down there. I walked the route.
So that actually is a great, what I'd like to sort of pull out of that is just the idea that you had to tailor that measurement process to a specific population. And so that sort of speaks directly back to sort of like, what are your goals of your project? What is the goal of the change? What's the purpose of evaluating so that you can learn? And so that oftentimes is subjective. The value and the lessons that are learned from your measurement activities really come from that tailoring, making sure that you answer the right questions and pick the right data and those kinds of things. So I appreciate that you talked about the challenge, but also just something that we'll talk about later on in the webinar is that you don't have to go through this alone, and that's really where the benefit of working collaboratively with current research partners or seeking out other people in that process is very helpful. So thank you very much, Lieutenant Moss. And for those who are interested, there's a lot of information on the Smart Policing website about the good work that the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office is doing. So I want to move away from sort of this helicopter view about what's the purpose behind measurement and some of the ways that we can think about the benefits of measurement, and look at some specific methods that you might be able to use in your measurement efforts. So the next slide offers a number of ideas and suggestions about different methods for collecting data and really uncovering sort of what's behind the change efforts and the change activities. It also offers a review of the advantages and the disadvantages of each method. It doesn't cover every potential measure that exists out there in terms of data collection, but it does provide a good summary of some of the most common methods that are used in studying organizational change. I want to forewarn you that there is a lot of information on this slide, but I have done this on purpose, primarily because I wanted to give you something that was a takeaway that you can look back on after today to help you think about various methods. So I won't discuss each of these methodologies, but I would present you with a number of considerations as you work through your own process. The table provides a summary of methods for collecting data. I personally think these are the most common, but they're not the only methods used in the study of organizational change. Most of the techniques used in organizational studies rely on qualitative data, meaning stories or narratives or thick descriptions that provide some depth and give meaning to what occurred, why it occurred, and how change occurs. And in fact, using these various methodologies offers insights into the very complex dynamics of change, something not always possible when you rely solely on numbers or quantitative data as a way to assess change. And this doesn't suggest that using qualitative methods is any less rigorous, because it's not, but with any methodology you want to use a systematic process that relies on sound methods and data that ultimately will support your evaluation results. So the methods presented here, along with their advantages and disadvantages, support the kinds of organizational change activities that we are interested in learning about. So to sort of connect this back to SPI, I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in Lowell. As I mentioned, they're interested in integrating evidence-based practices into their training efforts, and they're currently focused on a field training officer program, so new police officer recruits who are about to move from the academy training into the field. So our evaluation is looking to assess how the program they currently have a program, but they're modifying that program. So we want to look at those modifications, and we want to look at if and how supervisor responsibilities change in that process, and if the new recruits who are entering the patrol use the research and evidence provided through the new curriculum in their field work. So we're using a number of techniques that are shown here, which some would call a multi-method approach. So you don't have to rely on just one method in your measurement process. You can combine methods. You can select a few different methods. Ultimately, what you want to be doing is thinking about what is it that we want to learn, what's the purpose of our measurement, what kind of questions that we want to answer, and then how do we go about getting that data. So in Lowell, we're using a multi-method approach. What we're doing is we're documenting conversations and decisions that are made at curriculum review meetings to help us understand sort of the various issues or challenges that may be coming up in their change efforts. We are developing a pre- and post-test survey for new officers to assess the change in their knowledge before and after they participate in the new program. We will also conduct focus groups with supervisors to assess if and how their supervisory practices have changed as a result of this new curriculum. And we also hope to interview recruits several months into their actual field training program to see if and how they are using new knowledge in the field. So we have, going back to what Lieutenant Moss had sort of suggested, we have tailored our measurement activities, our documentation activities around the specific change efforts and around what it is that we want to know about not just the what happened as a result of this new program, but what can we learn about the process. So before we move on from this point, I think it would be helpful to think about how we pull all these pieces together so far. And again, I recognize that for some folks, this is a new concept, or maybe they have not done evaluation work before, so there's a lot here to think about. One tool that I have found to be invaluable in answering the right questions and helping me make sure that each step is purposefully connected is this tool called the logic model. So a logic model, some of you this may be familiar to some folks. A logic model is a visual tool that helps you organize the various pieces. It forces you to be clear and precise about what the change is and what and how you will measure. And so I introduce this now because I want to help you to think about how do you pull these pieces together? How do you stay on track with these pieces? If you really want to create a parallel and complementary process to the actual change, this is a great way to make sure that the measurement piece is on target. And as I mentioned, some of you may be familiar with logic models because they're often used in grants. But for those who have not, there are many examples of logic models available on the web, on the internet, and the content really ends up being tailored to your needs. Most importantly, a logic model is a tool for organizing the pieces to reflect a whole. So I offer this here as an example of how the logic model was used in the program that the work that we're doing on smart policing in Lowell. As I have constructed it, it connects the specific activities of change to the goals of change. So on the top of each of the columns, we've identified some critical pieces of our smart policing work. What is it that we're interested in changing? What are the specific changes that we need to introduce to affect those current conditions as I've noted them? What is it that we are expecting to happen? And then how will we measure that? So for folks who are familiar with sort of planning, maybe planning for big safety events or major events, and this is a different form of a planning tool, but it's a great way for you to focus your evaluation and measurement activities around the actual change that's happening. It really offers you a roadmap. You can modify this as you need to. You can include timelines. You can include specific outputs. But by offering up this review of the logic model, my hope is that you can start to imagine how the various steps and the various pieces can come together in a much more practical example of how you would bring together the measurement of change. What I also have provided, the next slide, is the specific chart for the evaluation work that we're doing that complements the logic model. So this really lays out what is it from the measurement perspective we're interested in understanding. What's our evaluation question? What data will we use to help to answer that? How will we collect that data? And you can see here that I organized this around what are we interested in relative to process, and then what is it that we are interested relative to outcomes. Now, I personally find this to be particularly helpful because it keeps me focused and on track. And it's a lot of work on the front end, but you can see how the pieces are starting to come together in a way that's organized and systematic. So the idea about answering key questions, creating specific process, and organizing this is really at the heart of these tools. So I also want to be a realist. And I want to recognize that despite all of the planning that I have done or the planning that maybe that you do, there will always be challenges in the process of measuring or evaluating change. And that's comforting to me now that I have gone through this quite a bit, because when you first start out trying to evaluate something, what you want is for it to go as planned, or you'd like your evaluation work to be perfect, but actually it's more common than not that something may happen or come along to disrupt the measurement or evaluation process. So what we really want to do is position ourselves to recognize and problem solve these challenges. So what I say is what we want to do is we want to expect challenges, but we don't want to be defeated. So there are many unexpected things that can happen along the way, but we should recognize those and identify the resources around us to help to problem solve those. And I can offer a few examples. In Lowell, we're still working on what elements of the field training officer program need to be measured, and then how we'll do that. One particular challenge that we are experiencing that I know happens often, pretty regularly, is that there are changes in personnel. In Lowell, they're actually in the process of a leadership change, and so that there's an interim police superintendent, and they're going through the process of selecting a new police superintendent. So this certainly has impacted the speed of the change process. It also has impacted our ability to focus in on some of those measurement activities. So realistically, you have to be prepared for disruptions, and either jump to plan B or identify ways to problem solve. Ultimately, I think what we can expect is that change can take a long time. So we want to maintain a sense of energy in our evaluation work. In some cases, you may be the only one who cares about your evaluation, so it may require more work on your part to articulate why measurement matters. It can be very difficult to specify which factors influence the change outcomes. But this is very important to our work, our smart policing work and our organizational change work. So if we're able to identify the potential factors that improve or enhance our work, we can then introduce those factors in other ways. What we want to do is to at least recognize that challenges will occur, and we want to figure out how do we take advantage of those challenges, how do we face those challenges head on so that we can also learn from those. So I'd like you to think about your own challenges and also think about, turn it into a more positive about the opportunities that are presented when you do experience challenges. At this point, I'd like to introduce Steve Shermack, who is from Michigan State University. He's the research partner with the Michigan State Police Smart Policing Initiative, and I have talked to Steve about some of the challenges that they're experiencing or have experienced, but also what it is that they're learning. So I've asked Steve to make a few comments to tell us a little bit about how these ideas are playing out in his experience in Michigan.
Brenda, can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you great. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Brenda, and thanks everybody for joining us today. As Brenda noted, MSU is the research partner who's been working with Michigan State Police to sort of document the use of evidence-based policing in a full-service state police agency. We've been trying to identify the organizational supports for and sort of the barriers to its use, as well as how the organization has come to learn and understand the changes that are occurring with the organization. And ultimately, we hope to sort of recommend policies and procedures that can be implemented to increase its use, change its use, and also understand how it's helping transform the organization. So in terms of the questions on the slide, how can you systematically collect data and information? We've done a variety of different things. Many of the things Brenda noted earlier in the different types of methodologies that you could use. We started very early on by doing a organizational level survey. It was a web-based survey. And really what we tried to do was to understand the baseline information regarding what evidence-based practices are in use, the types of data sources that are used, the characteristics of active evidence-based respondents, as well as the major hurdles to change. So that survey was done at one point in time, so you can see how using it in a follow-up manner after an initiative has been put into place would be one way to sort of measure change and measure differences. Our initial survey was quite long, probably too long, but it doesn't have to be in terms of measuring change, and that actually really could be straightforward in fielding such a survey. Based on what we learned, though, from that survey, and in working with Michigan State Police, we wanted to then reach out to some of those places where evidence-based practices seem to be working and seem to be working well. And so we then did a series of case studies where we went to various locations throughout the state. We interviewed key personnel, key informants about why it worked or why certain programs worked and certain things that were put in place and what had to be in place to make change happen. And importantly, we sort of looked at these issues retrospectively, sometimes several years after a program was done or a particular procedure was put into place. And so then our respondents were able to sort of talk about the history of not only the initiative, but also how it's changed over time and some of the additional hurdles that have come up in terms of sustaining a particular effort. And then again, in working with Michigan State Police in terms of next steps, one of the things we realized that trying to change the direction of a whole organization is quite difficult, and that it would be effective to sort of take a step back somewhat and then really focus on post commanders and what we can do to get post commanders to institute some change within their posts in terms of how they use data and how they put evidence-based practices into play. And so what we've done and what we're in the process of doing is we've interviewed post commanders to understand some of the challenges that they face, some of their major problems, and then we're going to turn around and then train them through webinar and other means to sort of help them better understand how they're going to use data, strategic practices, or how they can use data better. And then we'll go back to see how they're doing it differently and sort of measure that. And so we hope, and what this information has been used for, again, we're the research partner. So what we've always done is, we report back to the organization, and they've been terrific in terms of listening to what we found, and then strategically thinking about what changes have to occur within the organization to institute change and make the organization move in certain directions. And so implementing policies, thinking about training, thinking about changes in training, thinking about expanding particular training, what things have to be put in place in the future, and then really thinking about gaps in service delivery and thinking about the kind of data support that's provided, sorts of trainings that have been put in place to sort of support the use of data, but then how those training exercises can be sort of tweaked to make it easier for people to use data and sort of deploy data strategically. There's a lot of challenges, as anybody, all the practitioners sort of on the line know. I mean, the time is the most significant problem. As we were talking to post commanders, in terms of the time that they have to actually strategically analyze data, think about how that data, and then strategically implementing, some procedure to respond based on what it takes an extraordinary amount of time out of a schedule that's already overbooked and overbusy. And so what we hope to do in sort of this process is sort of think about, how that time can be used somewhat more effectively. The other big challenge really is the use of data. The Michigan State Police has done an extraordinary job trying to train all staff, including post commanders, on how to use these data sources. But anybody who's worked with data knows it's complicated, it's frustrating, and sort of overcoming some of that frustration is a big hurdle. And so this sort of constant retraining and sort of hand-holding, people to get through the process and to sort of put the data to better use. And then, so what we're trying to do now is, based on what we've learned from the post commanders, is sort of a feedback loop, where we're creating a webinar that will support, we'll work directly with the post commanders and provide whatever assistance we can, helping them think about the use of data and then putting it to use. And then ultimately then we'll look at how it's changed their practices and how they do business.
So, Steve, there are several things about your story that I like and would just sort of like to point out as we continue this conversation. I think first is just earlier you mentioned the idea of the survey that you had used being kind of long. And you didn't say this, but that made me think about sometimes actually getting the data when you're trying to evaluate different programs, practices, and changes. Sometimes getting the data can be a challenge in and of itself. Getting people to give you the data, getting people to fill out surveys, or to meet with you, and especially given the already overburdened and sometimes conflicting schedules that people have every day. So that is the kind of challenge that I think that we should think about. But one thing that I think is fantastic about what Michigan State Police are doing is that working with the post commanders directly and getting those people involved and collecting the narrative from those folks, so that qualitative information that you collect in stories and feedback and experiences, it provides you with some real rich understanding of what's happening, but also I think also reinforces some of the things that we know about organizational change, is that when you're really trying to affect what people do and how people think and behave in organizations, having them involved in that process is one of the factors that can contribute to success. So, but I think that just by engaging those post commanders in the way that you have been doing up in Michigan is going to have a significant impact on how people operate in the future. And then using what they tell you to inform change in the future, I think is another way that you're just not just affecting change, but you're also pointing out the value of measuring that change. So I think that the examples, the stories that you provide from Michigan are great in terms of what I see as some real good progress, but also the reality check that it's not always easy, but there are some significant benefits. So thank you very much for sharing that with us today. And hi to my friends from Michigan State Police. While I want to recognize that there are a lot of challenges to measuring change, I don't want to spend too much time to scare people. What I really would like to do is to also validate that there are ways that you can overcome challenges, and so many of us have learned, and certainly Lieutenant Moss and Dr. Shermack from Michigan have pointed out that the relationship between the research partner and the folks that are on the ground has been very helpful, and it certainly is one way to overcome some of these challenges. Those kinds of conversations and planning and problem-solving discussions are really helpful to overcoming some of these challenges. So other academic institutions or organizations near you or in your community that may have an interest is a place where you can go, form some relationships, seek out people who have different knowledge, skills, and abilities in either measurement or change that can help you in your process. Don't overlook the internal resources in the agency that you work in that may be able to help in this measurement process. So whether it's existing committees, groups, motivated staff who are either just intrinsically interested in change or are able to use that for their own learning and development. Look for people who have an interest. Think about interns who may be able to help in that process. But ultimately, there may be a lot of internal resources that can contribute. Also, there may be different tools that already exist. I've offered a couple here. I know that you'll see on the chat box, the smart policing folks have posted some things about logic models. BJA's website for grantees offers just some wonderful tools and suggestions, ideas, frameworks for evaluation. So I would encourage you to look at BJA and the resources on the internet. But don't be afraid to try something new in terms of evaluation. Just becoming comfortable with the steps that we've talked about in the process is just a first step, but there may be ways that you can go out and have conversations, do focus groups, but just try something new. You will learn as much, and that will be as valuable. So a few sort of takeaways that I think from my experience, both as a practitioner in my other life and as a researcher now who's working with practitioners, that measurement, the investment in measurement can really pay off. It will help you understand change and inform future decisions. I emphasize that sort of investment in that early planning phase, thinking about the process, thinking about what data, because I think the quality of your design will really improve the results and the insights that you gain. I'm an advocate for starting measuring change early. But also, I have relied on so many people, even after 20 years of experience involved in these kinds of activities, I still seek others to make sure that I'm thinking about things the right way, I'm understanding things, I'm problem solving. But I feel like investing in this process, in the measurement planning and implementation, engaging people, communicating, it really does add a sense of legitimacy to the change, and I think that that's really important. So I would say some of these ideas are sort of some of the fundamental takeaways. The next couple of slides I'd like to wrap up, so maybe we could get some participation comments and suggestions, but this next slide offers highlights some case studies that are great stories about the successes and challenges of change that have occurred, at least in police organizations, over the last couple of decades. So for those interested in what occurred and how change gets documented, these are great resources. I have a few notes here about how change was measured in one of these specific cases, the Savannah, Georgia experience. They embarked on a significant change effort, which was to transition to community policing and to affect concerning crime rates. They used a multi-method design to measure and report on their change. They use qualitative data, which is the documentation of changes, existing case studies, reports, and organizational documents. But they also looked at quantitative data, which is the crime rates that they used as an outcome measure. So these are examples of cases that can help you think about what your measurement process may look like. In addition to some of the more obvious ideas above, on this slide about partnering, building internal capacity, there are a number of organizations, larger organizations, such as the International Association of Law Enforcement Planners, the Law Enforcement Organization of Planning and Research Directors, which is supported significantly by BJA and CNA, and other national evaluation groups. These are resources that you can use that will help you think about all the questions that we've talked about and the various methodologies that may work for you. Within some of these resources, you can also learn just generally about organizational change. So I offer them up as some additional resources for you to use to maybe support or expand some of the conversation that we've had today. So we have come almost to the end of our webinar, but I would be remiss if I didn't say go Sox. Tonight is the first game of the World Series in Boston, and I know you'll all be rooting for us.
You're asking a lot from a Midwesterner, Brenda. I'll tell you that right now.
I hope that we have a little bit of time, maybe, Chip, for either some questions or some suggestions, comments, observations, experiences that might be helpful to the rest of us.
Yeah, let's open it up for a few minutes. If anybody has any questions or comments for Brenda or for David Moss or Steve Shermack, I really appreciate their input on this webinar today. And there's a lot of ground covered. I I agree with Brenda that, you know, studying this stuff is like a lifetime collaboration, and there's a lot of people out there that are willing to help. I think that's one of the beauties of this smart policing project, is that you're instantly linked to hundreds of people who are working on these issues. But if anybody has any questions or remarks at this time, please feel free.
Well, I'm happy to, I just want to say thank you to everybody for taking the time. I know, as I mentioned, that beyond the general idea of integrating evaluation into your work, everybody has a very sort of properly demanding and packed schedule. So I hope that this webinar has been useful and worth the time that you've taken out of your schedule. I also have included my email address and my telephone number, so I would love to hear from folks. As Chip has said, I am certainly a lifelong learner as it comes to these kinds of things, and to be able to be connected to a network of folks who are interested in and experiencing some of the same kinds of things would just be such a great benefit for me. So I appreciate everybody being here today and hope that anybody feels comfortable reaching out to me offline.
Good. Thank you, Brenda. And thanks again to Dave and Steve. I also want to just take a moment to thank the folks at CNA and our other SMEs who work on this webinar series. Zoe, Vivian, Mike White, and Hildy Seisau. Everybody has kind of pitched in along the way over the past few years to launch this series of webinars, and I greatly appreciate it. I'd like to let everybody know that we have several upcoming webinars. Next week, Monday afternoon, folks from Arizona State University will present a new webinar on social network analysis. I think you'll find that very interesting. In November, we'll have John Eck come back and do a webinar on crime in places. Scott Decker will present a webinar on December 4th on focused deterrence and offender call-ins. We have a planned webinar in January with Chief Davis from Palo Alto, California, on how to be a smart police chief. And then probably later on in January, early February, I'm actually working on a webinar around the role of restorative justice in smart policing. So that's what's coming up. Please stay in touch. Please stay in tune with the website. And as Brenda said, if you have any questions or you think about something that you need or you want or that we would be helpful with, please contact us. Okay? And
Thank you, Chip.
Remember your evaluation, please. Okay? Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
Thank you.